have the opening slide up, please? Yes, we can go to the next slide, please. So when we talk about Great Place to Work is into workplace culture assessment. When we talk about workplace culture assessment, we look at it through a two-part lens. The first part of the framework is the trust index model, which is what the employees experience at the workplace. What is it that the employees have to say about the workplace? What is their experience across various dimensions that you see on the screen of credibility, respect, fairness, pride, and camaraderie. And that part of the lens holds 75% of the weightage in our recognition when we say the best companies to work for. Now, the other 25% is on the culture audit methodology. What is the culture audit methodology? So, of course, when we say that employees experience a particular level of workplace culture that needs to be that's impacted by a certain level of people practices, policies, supporting infrastructure that creates that kind of an employee experience. And that in our terminology is called as the culture audit model, which you see on the right side of my screen. What I'm going to talk about in today's webinar is focusing on part 2 of the lens, which is the culture audit methodology. Can we have the next slide up, please? So before we kind of deep dive into each of the areas of culture audit methodology, setting a slightly broader context as to what we look at when we say Great Place to Work for All methodology. Now, the idea of for all methodology is to say that not just one or two employee groups within the organization need to experience a strong level or a positive work experience. The for all methodology says that every employee or every employee group within the organization, regardless of their demographic background, need to experience a consistent level of positive experience today in the organization. That forms the base of for all methodology. Now, if we are to say employee experience, what are those policies, what are those programs, what are those practices that create that impact and create such for all experiences? We look at the culture audit model or the culture audit lens through the 5 main things that you see on the screen. The first is trust, which is building on the fact that trust is at the center of employee experience. So what are those policies, practices, and initiatives that create trust within the organization? Second is maximizing human potential. In line with our for all methodology, this says that what are those programs and how do organizations create a positive or a consistent experience for every diverse group within the organization today? How do they kind of ensure equitable implementation of practices for all the demographic groups such that everybody in the organization feels a sense of belonging? Third is values, which of course the big and the small decisions within the organization need to be driven by something, and values are the guiding force. Values or the overall philosophy act as the guiding force for all these decisions. That's the third part of the culture audit model. The fourth is leadership effectiveness, because we're saying so everything that we do today in the organization needs to flow from the top, starting with saying what is the organizational direction, how does my leadership want to go achieve that organizational vision and act on the organizational vision and the mission. So leadership effectiveness talks about that. And then we have innovation by all, of course, building on the fact that in today's environment, we need to be agile such that we stay relevant. Therefore, what are the practices or the ways in which organizations are able to create that kind of space for innovation and ideation within the organization? So these 5, trust, maximizing human potential, values, leadership effectiveness, and innovation by all, comprise together the Great Place to Work culture audit model. Now, the financial growth that you see on the screen, that's not something we assess, but why is it on the screen is because when we have the other 5 in place, financial growth is more like an outcome of having a great culture in place. So that's really the culture audit model. Now let's deep dive into each of these 5 areas that make up our culture audit model. We can go to the next slide, please. Great. So trust. What is it that we look for in trust? Of course, we do understand that it's a very broad term. But if I were to break this down to saying what are those initiatives that create trust, what do we typically mean is uh, tell us those specific initiatives, programs, and policies that create your organization's unique culture, right? While we do understand that a lot of programs could be similar across the organizations, but how they are implemented kind of is the differentiator between various organizations. So those specific programs, policies, initiatives that create the unique culture within the organization. Of course, the whole idea here is to say, how does this tie to my overall organizational philosophy, right? It's not just saying we have 10 wonderful programs or 20 wonderful programs. It's more about saying my overall organizational philosophy or the DNA or the EVP is this, and therefore these are the programs that I use to kind of create the to create the culture that my organization today stands for, right? So how do I include everybody while I'm implementing a program? How do I ensure that every program that I have within the organization touches upon all my employees? So what we're trying to understand from trust is a list of benefits, initiatives, or programs that reflect the uniqueness of your culture, the uniqueness of your organization. Uh, that's what we look at under trust. Um, Another important, no, we can hold on the previous slide, please. Of course, while we're saying we do understand that trust is more a qualitative term. We're trying to understand the programs. However, at the same time, what we're also trying to understand is the implementation on ground. Now, we may have 20 beautiful programs, but until and unless there is strong implementation, successful implementation on ground, it becomes difficult to kind of evaluate the programs mentioned. So that's why in our methodology, we always say whatever other programs mentioned need to be supported with strong impact numbers, strong matrix. When we say impact, it could be quantitative, it could be qualitative. Quantitative to say your development programs coverage numbers, survey feedback results, utilization numbers of the wellness programs, for example. And qualitative impact could be employee testimonials, employee quotes, supporting the programs that are mentioned. So that's the idea of trust. That's what we look at under trust. We can go to the next slide, please. The next one that we look at is the maximizing human potential. Uh, what is the objective of the question? What we're trying to understand is how do I ensure that everybody, an organization may have various diverse groups within the existing today. How do we ensure that each group feels an equal sense of belonging and they are able to realize their true potential, right? If I were to break this broad term down to what is it that exactly makes up maximizing human potential? Of course, it starts with saying, how do I ensure baseline equity? When I say baseline equity, in terms of, let's say, developing, am I providing equal opportunities for development? So that's trainings, performance management, career growth opportunities to each and every group within the organization. How do I ensure that I reward each and every employee or employee groups for the kind of efforts, the kind of performance, and the kind of contribution that they are making today to the organization? Right? So rewarding and developing and equitable initiatives around that, a big part of maximizing human potential. We also understand, because we are saying that we want to make each and every diverse group feel, ensure that they feel a sense of belonging, our diversity, equity, and including initiatives become a huge part of maximizing human potential. So for example, a returning mom today may need a very different infrastructure to thrive at the workplace as compared to somebody who's just started out the career, right? My new hires may need a very different kind of support infrastructure to thrive in the organization versus my tenured employees. So when we say create a sense of belonging for everybody, this is D&I, diversity and inclusion initiatives across the demographics, age, gender, tenure, um, functions, my key talent groups. Do I have something for my managers? Do I have something for my high potentials? Do I have something for my leaders? So that's again something that we look at under maximizing human potential. Of course, the third biggest point under this is also to say that if I am to maximize the potential of each and every individual, I need to be able to create that space that allows every individual's unique strengths to be utilized. Right? So how are we ensuring that my employees' unique strengths are utilized? Am I offering them enough job rotation opportunities? What is my IJP? Do we have employee resource groups for work and non-work related reasons that enable people to come together and work towards a common interest? So that's how also we look at saying how do we leverage the uniqueness of every employee within the organization to bring out their best. And of course, we are saying that creating workplaces for all where everybody can thrive definitely is the objective. This needs to be driven from the top, which means that my leaders today need to be accountable, need to be equipped to be able to create such workplaces. So how do I enable this level of my employees to make sure that they create such teams going forward, which means any of my leadership development program, any of my unconscious bias training program, am I holding them accountable enough to create such a workplace culture is something that we look at under maximizing human potential. I think the common idea that we need to keep in mind or that we look at when we say maximizing human potential is any initiative or any program or any policy that brings out the best in your people through developing them, through rewarding them, by ensuring that kind of a support and retail infrastructure. And of course, needless to say, all of the data that we look at needs to be supported through enough impact numbers, whether it is qualitative or whether it is quantitative. That's largely the idea of maximizing human potential. We can move to the next slide, please. Right. The third part of our culture audit methodology is values, right? So of course we say, just as individuals need to have a certain framework, a certain guiding force, values act as that kind of a guiding force or guiding principles for organizational decisions. What are those two to three things we look at when we say values that drive organizational decisions, right? First thing we're looking at, of course, saying what are an organization's values, right? What are the values? What are the manifestations of it? What do they mean in your organizational context? Because values, just as words or on paper, may be common to everybody, but the way in which they are adapted may be very unique to each organization. Therefore, it is equally important for us to understand what do these values mean in a particular organization context. So we look at values and we want to overall understand what is the strength of values foundation in organizations today, right? The first part of it could be, of course, stating what are the organizational values, how are they developed, how are they communicated and reinforced across the organization such that employees are aware they need to live by them. The second part of it, when I say my values foundation, is also to say that my values are not just to be put up on walls or they are to be on paper. Values typically need to be lived day in and day out. So how do we ensure that values are integrated very well with everything that an organization or its employees do day in and day out? For example, integration of values into key people practices, in hiring. Do I consciously look at values when I hire people? Welcoming. How am I ensuring that my new hires are aware of my value system? Or even performance management, which goes on to indicate the strength of the values foundation and the importance that an organization places on values, right? Apart from that, we also say, okay, this is tying values into key people practices. But apart from that, do we also have any other examples where we live our values? They could be relating to empathy, it could be supporting, it could be communications, it could be integrity. Whatever it may be, it is imperative for us to understand how they are lived day in and day out. So that's again something that goes into saying, okay, what is the values foundation in the organization? And I think the last and the most important piece which we look at when we say values is also to say how do we use our values in difficult situations, right? How do they influence my decision making in difficult situations? When we say difficult situations, what we typically mean is what happens in case of non-adherence or misalignment to values. Do we have an escalation matrix in place? Have we taken some strong calls to make sure that we stand by our values whenever there is a non-adherence or misalignment to our organizational values by an employee or a customer or a vendor or any other stakeholder that we work with. So that's the idea of values, to understand the strength of the values foundation. Let's move to the next slide. Yes, thank you. The fourth part that we look at when we say culture audit model is the leadership effectiveness. Now, big 2 to 3 things that we're trying to understand through leadership effectiveness, starting off with saying, uh, what is the organization's true north? What is it that they are working towards, right? So what is my philosophy that the organization is building, and what is that long-term strategy that the organization is working towards in the next, let's say, 3 years, 5 years, or 7 years down the line? Of course, the idea is to understand the strategy from the people as well as the business perspective, because this kind of helps us understand the people related initiatives in the business context. So that's the first thing that we look at. The second thing that we're trying to understand when we see leadership effectiveness is saying, okay, they have a very clear true north. We have our strategic focus areas laid out, but how did we develop them? Right? The idea is not to say one approach is better than the other. The idea here is just to understand what has been the development process. Now, it could be top down, it could be driven totally top down, it could be collaborative, right? But what is the development process? What are the levels and layers of employees involved when we were formulating our strategic focus areas is something that we're trying to understand when we say strategy development. The third and the most important aspect of leadership effectiveness is saying, okay, we have a beautiful strategy in place and we involve people when we were developing them, for example. Now is the time to implement it. When we say implement, again, we're breaking this down into a couple of 2 to 3 sub points. One is saying, first, for it to be implemented successfully, everybody needs to be made aware of the strategy, right? So how are we communicating the strategy? How are we cascading the strategy such that every employee on ground knows what they are working towards? So that's communication of the strategy. The second sub point is to say, if strategic focus areas are so important to the organization, how are we ensuring that every individual's work is tied into the overall strategy, right? Because they have to know the kind of impact that they make when they come to work every day. So that's why what is what are the ways in which we are trying every individual's work to the overall strategic focus areas. And the third aspect is, because my leaders and managers play a very instrumental role in strategy implementation, it becomes all the more important for organizations to be to enable this group and this layer of people such that they are able to help their teams to act or deliver on the strategy. So let's say any leadership development programs, training, resources, information that this group of employees may need to do their jobs well. So these 2 to 3 big things make up leadership effectiveness for us. Yes, thank you. The fifth part of the culture audit model is innovation by all. Now, when we say innovation, excuse me, we're looking, I'm going to split this into 2 parts, right? First is to say, what is the innovation ecosystem within the organization? Saying what are those dedicated, structured channels through which employees can submit their ideas, share their ideas, give their ideas, or submit their projects. We're looking at those dedicated and structured channels. Second part is to say, how am I facilitating or encouraging innovation today within the organization? right? It could be in form of any trainings, any resources, any physical collaborative spaces that I can help my employees with to nurture innovation today in the organization, right? Another aspect of innovation ecosystem is to say, uh, if I were to encourage my employees to contribute towards innovation, how am I rewarding them for their efforts? Right? So recognition linked to innovation. Again, two parts to this. The first part clearly saying somebody gave an idea, got implemented, they are rewarded in monetary and non-monetary ways. But another part of rewarding also says, how do I share feedback with the rejected ideas? Excuse me for that. Because I want to make sure that these people are encouraged enough to submit their ideas next time around. How am I ensuring that the right feedback goes to these people so that they keep sharing ideas for innovation? So that's recognition tied into innovation. And of course, the third part saying all of this is good, right? We have dedicated channels, we have very strong recognition built in. Uh, but how is it translating on ground? Which means what is the impact? And when we say impact, what we're really looking at is what are those strong 3 to 4 examples of innovation that are driven by employees? So ideas suggested by employees. What are the people and who are the people and teams behind it? What was the before and the after idea implementation status, right? Because that will convey the success of implementation. Now, this all definitely adds up to innovation ecosystem today. However, when we to penetrate, like I said, we look at big ticket innovation or organizational driven innovation. That's also given weightage under this question in terms of how do I improve my products, processes, business, etc. But you also look at innovation in daily improvements, right? So what are those ideas that may be coming from people whose core role may not be innovation or research and development, but they contribute equally at their own level to better a particular process. That in turn may impact the efficiency or the productivity positively, that just creates better ways of working. So when we say innovation, it's not just the big ticket items, but also how we're enabling people to come up with small daily improvements. And that is how we look at innovation by all. I think before we go to what is it that the best do differently, I'd also like to call out one question which you may not see on the slide, but which is an optional extra credit question. The first 5 areas that we spoke about: trust, maximizing human potential, values, leadership effectiveness, and innovation by all, they are mandatory for all organizations, right? Which means all my submissions will have mandatory information under these 5 areas. However, there is a sixth question, which is an optional but an extra credit question, which says, what is the bold act of leadership that an organization has been performing to improve workplaces, not just for their employees, but the society in which they operate, right? What we're trying to understand through this question is, of course, the first 5 questions and the responses to that tell us how an organization, the initiatives that an organization has to create good workplace cultures for their employees. But how are the organizations using their time, investment, effort, money to better the stakeholders going beyond their employees, right? So CSR initiatives, organizations providing employment opportunities to that sector of the society that may not otherwise have formal access to job opportunities, right? So it's not just that this question needs to have responses only for other stakeholders apart from your employees. Even for your employees, initiatives could be mentioned, but only those that are different from the usual way of doing things. For example, probably your well-being initiatives may not be a bold act of leadership, But let's say organizations taking a call to do away with the bell curve, right? Something that's very separate or something that's very different from how traditionally they may have been operating, but has had a large scale impact. That is something that can be called as a bold act of leadership. Uh, Disclaimer here, while it is an optional question, it's not mandatory. There are bonus marks or there are extra credits to those who've answered the question. So that's something that is also looked at when we look at recognition. Right. Now, I think I've covered the parts that make up our culture audit and what is it that we look at within each of these 5 to 6 areas. What I'd also like to share with all of you today is to say, okay, every organization that participates, a great place to work, answers, submits responses to the same questions. But what is it that sets the best apart from the rest, right? How are their submissions the best of all the ones that have come to us? And that's something that I would want to talk about in my next slide. Can we have the next slide up, please? Yeah. The first one is, so this is more on the structure and the quality of the submissions, right? The first point is great detailing. The best of the best submissions, they're able to share with us the implementation details, the how of each of the practices that they have. So it's not just the what, communication programs or wellness programs, but they're also able to support the what with the how, which helps us understand how is it done in that particular organization, and that is why it sets them apart from the rest. So great detailing is definitely a key to having a good culture audit submission. Along with great detailing, there are parts to our question, right? So for example, when I spoke about leadership effectiveness, I said there are 3 parts to it. The first is the strategy, then it's the strategy development piece, and then is the strategy implementation piece. The best of the best do not miss out on any of the subparts of the question. So while they are able to support their how, their what with the how through details, implementation details, they also ensure that they have given us responses to each subparts of the question. So that's the first thing that sets the best apart from the rest. The second piece is connect the dots. So what we're trying to, why is this important, right? And what do we mean by connect the dots? What we're trying to understand from the submissions or from the culture audit that comes to us, it's called culture audit because we're trying to understand the culture of the organizations, right? As communicated by those programs and policies that may be mentioned. A list of programs, a long list of initiatives may not exactly help us, but if you're able to connect these initiatives to the larger organizational philosophy as to why are these the initiatives that best and truly reflect your culture, and if you're able to connect the dots in that regard, that kind of puts things into perspective for us because that helps us understand your overall culture and not just your individual programs or initiatives. So connecting the dots along with great detailing, equally important for creating the best submissions. And the third one is showing us the impact. This assumes a lot of importance, like I said, because it conveys the how of the programs, right? It conveys the success of implementation. We may have 20 different training and development programs, but what is the coverage of it? The coverage of those programs will, or the training feedback of those programs will communicate the success of the implementation. I may have a host of wellness initiatives, supporting initiatives that show care for my employees, but the actual adoption or the utilization of these initiatives will tell me how many of my employees are experiencing these initiatives. So from that perspective, the best submissions are also able to support all of their programs with strong quantitative or qualitative impact. These 3 put together kind of set the best submissions apart from the rest. Yes, and that's that from our side on the culture audit methodology. We'd be happy to take any questions that the group may have.
Thank you, Zeel, for the wonderful insights. I think this is something a lot of our partner organizations have been asking us over the past few months. So we thought it'll be a good idea for us to do this in this kind of a format. Once again, for all of you in the audience, please do start keying in your questions. But I'll possibly get started with the first one, Zeel, and this is something we get very often, which is on how should an organization approach the culture audit? Should it just be the HR team working on it, or is it also important to get input from the business leaders?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. Uh, while the responsibility is definitely to kind of get it together, is on the HR team, inputs from the leaders become equally important. Because of course we are saying that everybody needs to be involved in creating great workplaces at every organization, so they must always take inputs from the leaders while they are collating the submissions.
Wonderful. Uh, we have a couple of questions coming in. I'll possibly take the first one. So the question is, what is the criteria to get recognized for the best workplaces for women? So to start off with, every organization has to, of course, undertake the Trust Index survey and the culture audit assessment that we have. The eligibility for any organization to be considered for this category is that they need to have a minimum of 10% representation of women in their workforce. Now, out of all of the organizations that meet that eligibility criteria, we give weightage to what is the overall experience of women in the organization by way of their survey scores. We also give weightage to what is the representation across various levels, not just at individual contributor levels, but more importantly, mid and senior and executive levels as well. And thirdly, we also ask organizations to submit to us what are the initiatives that they've undertaken for their women employees specifically. And those get rated as part of our culture audit evaluation as well. So using all of these parameters, we arrive at the 100 best workplaces for women in India across industries, of course. All right. So the next question that Zeel I can put forward for you is what are some of the collaterals that we provide to organizations that they can refer to while making this submission?
Sure. So we provide a detailed PDF document that details out all the questions that we just spoke about. They are also supported with a couple of examples in their document. Apart from that, we have some video tutorials up on our website, as well as on our on the client side of the portal. So whenever they kind of go in to fill their submissions, each of these 5 questions will have a video link, short 2 to 3 minute video links with it that can be referred to while they're filling in their submissions.
Wonderful. And just for everybody's reference, we will also be sharing a recording of this session along with the deck that Zeel presented, so that all of you have that as reference material while going about your submission as well. I'll take the next question. So this methodology was newly introduced, and earlier we followed a different method. And you'd want to understand what went well and what could be better, as you may not have received detailed findings. So what you can do is you can actually approach your respective relationship manager or customer experience manager. They'll be happy to get you access to your findings from your culture audit. Of course, it may have to be a part of your scope. So we have a separate report which can give you the insights, and then we can also help you figure out what were some of the areas that you did well in terms of your culture audit and what could be better. So some of those inputs can be made available. You can reach out to your respective Great Place to Work representative, and they'll be happy to help you out. So the next question, Zeel, that's for you is, what are some of the innovations and activities we may make in our organization for better engagement of employees and to enhance the productivity? If there are some examples that do come to mind.
Sorry, so are we saying that examples for better engagement, or we're saying more specific innovation related?
Innovation related that may lead to overall engagement getting
Right.
better, but more specifically innovation related
Sure.
initiative.
So I'll speak about what we've seen usually in our submissions, right? I think one way when we say innovative or innovation culture, it's important to have dedicated channels. While we do have multiple communication channels, it's not the best idea to kind of double them up as idea sharing platforms, right? So that's the first and the foremost point, having dedicated channels. The reason to have dedicated channels is also because then I'm able to pick those ideas up and fast track them because they're dedicated people for it. So that's the first one. The second important one is recognition to tied into innovation. Right. So while we do understand sharing feedback with the rejected ideas may be a little bit of a longish process, but if we can immediately start off with recognizing the people who come up with ideas, I think recognition goes a long way in kind of encouraging employees to share ideas. And the third and the most important thing, we have called it as innovation by all, right? So to kind of explain that to the employees that it's not just big ticket innovation, but whatever it is that they may do at their individual or group level to kind of better the process or working ways of working for them is also considered as innovation, and we are recognizing you for that. So if we can get that message across, I think it will definitely help get that kind of innovation culture in place.
Thanks. Thank you, Zeel. So one other question. This is again more around a little bit technical in terms of the submission. So few of the initiatives were covered in the earlier culture audit submission. Should we cover them again in the new culture audit submission this year, or only cover new initiatives?
Okay. Okay, so if we're talking about comparisons, what we're seeking to understand what we're asking in our culture audit, right? We're asking you to give us programs that will truly reflect your culture, so that are the best representative of your culture. Your culture could be care, communication, connect. So please give us those programs that reflect care, communication, connect. It could be some continuing programs from the last year as well, because I'm assuming these would be your strongest and the best examples, right? Or the best programs. So please feel free to continue the initiatives from last year. But I think what we can do is to be able to support them with most recent impact. Right? And any other initiatives to that which you think may continue to reflect your culture could be added to the submissions as well.
Great. So I think in summation, basically, if it's something that's very, very key to the overall
That's right.
cultural
That's
philosophy, and then if it's continuing, it should still be mentioned, even though you would have done it last year. And at the same time, of course, whatever else you've added, that can be done
absolutely,
as well.
absolutely.
Great. So I'll take the next question. We have a question here that says, as the highest weightage is given to the trust index score, are organizations who have low or poor culture audit scores, do they still qualify as best workplaces? So the answer is yes. Technically, they do qualify as best workplaces so long as they have been certified by us as a great place to work. However, the chances are that these organizations will not make it to the best workplaces rankings because it is a relative ranking and we see a lot of organizations do well on both fronts. So, in a relative comparison sense, these organizations would miss out. But from an eligibility standpoint, an organization with poor culture audit scores will still be eligible to be a part of our rankings should they be certified by us as a great place to work. And there is a follow-up question which also asks whether do all organizations who are certified get considered for the great workplaces list or only those that have the highest scores or above a certain score in the trust index survey. So all organizations that are certified, which means the ones that score above 70% positive in the trust index survey, qualify to be a part of our best workplaces list. But like I said, it's only those amongst all of those qualified organizations that are the best that end up making it. And over the last 2 years, the number of organizations taking part in this has only been going up. So it's very crucial that an organization does well on both fronts, the survey and the culture audit, so as to have a good shot at making it to any of our best workplaces list. The next question, Zeel, I think for the bonus deck or the sixth question, the extra credit question, is it only CSR or are there some other elements also? I think the person asking this may have missed this, so it'll be good to reiterate.
Yeah, sure. So when we say bold active leadership, like we said, the initiatives could be A for the employees, or it could also or could also be for other stakeholders going beyond your employees to see what are the ways in which an organization positively impacts the society, the environment, and the larger community. Right now, when we said CSR, I said because it's a huge part of how organizations impact the stakeholders other than employees. So that's definitely a contributor to the bold active leadership question. Another examples that we usually see under bold active leadership is also, let's say, for employees, right? But one disclaimer here is we mentioned those initiatives for employees which are out of the ordinary, right? For example, I think the example that I quoted was, let's say, organizations taking a decision to do away with the bell curve. Now that's an initiative which is very different from how traditionally things have been operating, but impacts a large scale of employees, right? So that is for our internal employees, but that's very way out of the ordinary way of doing business. So that's one example. Another example, which is a non-CSR example, is let's say we've seen a lot of organizations use the time of their leaders, use their effort, use their connections to mentor the budding startups or the small business or the small entrepreneurs, right? And that's how they kind of create an impact in the larger society. Or some of the organizations who get people from that strata of the society who may not otherwise have formal access to education or job. They kind of get them on board with them, train them for a year, and then place them within the organization. So that's another example of a bold act of leadership. So examples like these, along with CSR, will definitely be considered relevant for the question.
Wonderful. So what I hear you say is anything that's radical, the
Yes.
leadership would have undertaken and which would have had a large scale impact. So apart from CSR, that can be taken.
Absolutely.
So we'll take the next few questions as well, but just before that, we'd like to get all of your feedback on the insights shared by Zeel and the session so far. So before we take our last few questions, can we have our team launch the feedback? This is for us to know whether you like the session, and of course, this will help us make these sessions more and more informative and better. So you'll be seeing the poll on your screen. Do share your feedback. We'll keep this on for a couple of seconds. Great. Another 10 seconds. So those of you who haven't given your feedback can quickly go and give it. It's right on the top of your screen. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So moving on to the next question. Zeel, this one's for you again. The collaterals which need to be submitted by the organizations as supporting documents for each questions. What is it that the Great Place to Work team looks for in it? What kind of supporting documents need to be provided, or is that discontinued in the new format?
Okay, so answered in two parts. That's not discontinued. You all can still continue sharing supporting documents with us. When we say what we typically look for is, we always say that whatever it is that are your main programs need to be mentioned in the main submission within the text boxes that are given on the portal. But the impact, when you want to support those programs with certain evidences, let's say images, let's say survey results, etc. of sorts, or maybe an email screenshot or something, is something that you can share as supplementary material. So it could be employee codes, it could be images, it could be anything in a PDF or an image format that you can continue adding to your submission such that it supports the initiatives mentioned.
Great. Thank you. The next question that I can possibly take is, do all organizations get their culture audit findings report independent of their trust index score? So the answer is no. Mostly our culture audit findings have a linkage to the trust index, and we don't share this as a default with all organizations. Only those organizations that may have opted for the detailed findings of the culture audit, we share the results with them. The next one is an interesting question, and I'm glad this was asked. So I'll possibly take this one, Zeel, as well. So before going in for an audit, how can we engage senior business leaders for this initiative? As generally, the Great Place to Work audit is considered an HR activity only. Therefore, how can we create buy-in from the leaders, as we would be needing inputs from them through the journey as well. So I'm very glad this was asked, and it's very crucial for this initiative to be led by the leaders itself. HR, of course, will be the key custodian and the chief facilitator, but this initiative has to be driven from the top, and thus it's important for leaders to understand why is it necessary from a business perspective as well. So as an organization, we at Great Place to Work, before having an organization sign up with us and undertake the process, we also do conduct very extensive orientations with leadership teams, where we talk about what we do and why is it important and why is it necessary for their involvement to make this successful, and what are the outcomes that this could have for the organization, not just from a culture standpoint, but from a business standpoint as well. So in case if you'd like us to come and speak to your leadership team and do an orientation of what we do and why should it merit their involvement and their sponsorship, do reach out to us. We will be very happy to do that as well. The next question: after audit, do we get any report of certain best practices followed by peers?
I'll take that one. I think before we move on to saying, do we get any best practices? Let's just take a step back and understand when we say best practices under the new methodology, how does that work, right? Now, the questions that we're really asking under the methodology, they're quite unique to each organization, right? Asking somebody about submitting their practices on, let's say, a hiring or a rewarding or a welcoming or such close-ended specific areas, right? We're asking that versus saying, how do you create trust within the organization today? Now, that's very unique to each organization, right? For example, one organization may say, we create trust by communicating, caring, and developing employees. The other organization may say, we create trust by rewarding people, appreciating people, and supporting people. So in that sense, it is not really fair to kind of compare the two, because both have different ways of creating trust within the organization today. Likewise, if we look at values, again, a very unique and very specific to each organization, right? Or a leadership effectiveness for that matter. So when we say best practices, I think what we should really focus on under the new methodology is to say, how do we make best submissions, right? And when I say making best submissions, are we addressing all the subparts of the question that I spoke about earlier on in the webinar and not really missing any one of the subparts of those questions? So I think for this methodology, it'll be more about creating those best submissions versus saying a best practice. So I think that's one point. However, if there are any specific areas that you may want, I'm talking to the one who may have specifically posed the question. If there are some very specific areas which may be very standard and common to every organization, for example, how do you cascade the values, or how have we seen involvement of people in strategy development, or what are those developing and rewarding initiatives, such standard parts of it. If we need best practices on that, please feel free to connect with us and we'll share them with you. But at least for parts that are very unique to each organizations, we will need to focus more on best submissions versus a best practice.
Thanks for sharing that. I think that comes with any particular submission that where we specifically want an organization to represent their own culture rather
Own
than
culture.
going by a templated format. But yeah, it's great you clarified. And for any specific best practices that any organization may need after their audit, you can always approach us. We'll be more than happy to share. And we of course have this across various industries, so we can find something that's more suited to your talent and your set of people as well. The last question I think that we will take, and if possibly time permits, one more. There are some parts of culture which are very subtle, and it takes years to build a good culture. And what employees are experiencing today or organizations are benefiting out of it is also a subset of that. So, how do you represent some of that subtle part of your culture, which may not necessarily be practices or policies? I'm sort of that's how I'm interpreting this. So do you have a point of view on that, Zeel?
Yeah. So I think first there can't be a one single answer to this. However, when we say, and that's why when we say culture creating, we're also saying creating that experience for the employees, right? And how do you create an experience when somebody kind of uh, understands and has used that and adopted that time and time and time again? So once they've experienced it frequently, that kind of builds up saying, whether this is a good or a bad or a worse. So when we say subtle parts of our culture, and if I have to frequently do that, somewhere down the line, they will be institutionalized practices to my mind, right? They will not be a one off. They will be more institutionalized practice, or we may call them initiatives, practice, ways, programs, anything we can call them. But they will be institutionalized somewhere down the line, having, they'll be repeated over and over again, such that your employees experience that even the subtle aspects of the culture, as you may want to call it. You may not say it's a structured initiative, but to my mind, it'll be done repeatedly enough or frequently for employees to experience it, and therefore it will become an institutionalized practice. So it's more about just mentioning it out there, and that's my really take on this one.
That's very interesting because we also get this question a lot that especially for organizations which aren't maybe that large in size, a lot of the subtlety or those elements come in largely from behaviors of leaders
That's
and
right.
not necessarily practices. So a leader may be empathetic in his or her approach, but it may not necessarily be a formal policy or a practice.
Practice around it.
Right.
Can
So
I
so a lot of those, yes.
go ahead, Akshat? I'll add to that.
So our submission to all of you is that even those elements which may not necessarily be structured practices or policies, but are behaviors or experiences that people are having in the organization, which is just by nature of how what the fabric of the organization is. Do talk about that in your submission as well.
Absolutely. And if I were just to add to that a little bit, how can you convey the success of those is employee testimonials, right? You may not really have those quantitative metrics, but employee testimonials, employee quotes definitely can go a long way in supporting these aspects as well.
Great. So we have one last input we need to share, but before we do that, just for those of you who've not had the opportunity to share your feedback around the session, we're going to launch the poll once more at the request of our team. So can we have the poll on screen for your feedback for all those of you who may not have been able to answer this earlier? And post that, we have one last question or a note that we will take very quickly before we end the session for today. Great. Another couple of seconds and we'll close the poll. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So the last question that we've gotten very often lately is what is the deadline, and by when can an organization complete the entire process, including the culture audit? So for all of your information, we are in the last phase of accepting registrations for this year's Best Workplaces study. So we would request all of you to get in touch with your respective Great Place to Work representatives and get started working on your culture audit itself so that you have enough time and you don't need to cram it right till the end. We are planning to close our study this year by early January. That is when an organization can last take their survey and their culture audit and submit their culture audit. But we have very limited slots for that as well. So in case if you're planning to do your assessment anytime in the next 3 to 4 months, do get in touch with us to get started right away. With that, thank you so much, all of you, for joining. Zeel, thank you so much for facilitating this session. We'll have more such webinars coming up in the next few days, so please stay tuned. And like I mentioned, we will, of course, be sharing the recording along with the deck that Zeel presented. And for any other support that you need, please do reach out to us or your Great Place to Work representative.
Thanks so much, Akshat, for moderating this. Before we log off, can I just give like quick 2 tips for a good culture audit submission?
Please
saved
do.
that for the last, honestly. So, okay, when you all are, so this is more on structuring the submissions. I think I always tell our clients, whenever you're starting to make such submissions, keep a mental note of what are your strongest programs, what are your best programs, and then kind of weave that, see how that kind of weaves that into your organizational fabric or your philosophy. When we say philosophy, it could be your EVP, DNA. So start off with that. It's always a good program. I always say that trust is very open-ended. I personally believe that, and it's very important to kind of understand how do we structure that. One quick tip is always to start off with the broader overall philosophy. Right? Philosophy could be, like I said, anything how an organization may perceive it to be, and then go on to say, okay, this is the framework that supports the philosophy, and these are the programs underlying that framework, and then mention the matrix, impact, etc. So that's one tip on answering that open-ended question. And I think the other tip is cross-referencing. Because there is a word limit of 5,000 words for each of the question, and it can be a very difficult task saying how do we depict our culture in 5,000 words. Cross-referencing is something that you can use. So if you think that there is one program but applicable across multiple areas, share the details under one section and just mention a reference of it in the other sections. However, for trust is very exclusive. Even though we as evaluators may believe that a program mentioned in other areas is very creative, is very strong, we cannot use our discretion to say, okay, this can be considered in trust because it's a very original and a unique program. Because trust is something that organizations need to tell us, whatever programs you'll mention in trust are very exclusive. For that section, we do not consider overlapping programs from other areas. But if at all you may want to, a cross-reference always helps. So you can probably mention a line on it and share the details in other areas. So these are the 2 tips that I have as an evaluator to kind of get the best submissions out. And of course, do not miss any parts, any subparts of any of the questions that make up our culture audit. I think that will really help in kind of making the right submissions and ensuring that we've covered the best of our programs. That's it from our side. Thank you so much, Akshat, for moderating this, and thanks to everybody for giving us your time.
Thank you. Have a great rest of the day, everybody.